Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's just gone past 1 o'clock here in the UK. Thank you to everyone who has logged on for today's webinar. We will just give the remaining attendees another minute or 2 minutes to join the webinar, and then we'll be right with you. Again, thanks for joining, and we'll start the broadcast in literally 1 minute. So again, thank you to everyone who's joined us for today's webinar, and welcome to it. My name is Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia. We're a specialist crisis management consultancy, and we help leaders of businesses to do and say the right things on the worst days of their corporate lives. And as we think about the situation that we've all been grappling with over the last 3-4 months, I think we are entering an interesting new phase, one which in our most recent webinar we described as the danger zone. There are further challenges ahead, sadly, and it's important to be ready for those future challenges. But I think now is also the time to take a short pause for reflection and to make sure that we are ready to begin that next phase and to set ourselves up for recovery. And I think that is recovery of businesses and organizations. Obviously, a lot of harm has been done to businesses in terms of revenue, value, its workforce in some cases being decimated, and clearly there are some challenging economic times ahead. So there is a business recovery job to be done, but there is also a personal recovery job to be done. People around the world, everybody has been suffering their own personal stresses, pressures and anxieties over the last 3 or 4 months, whether related to health, money, jobs, all three, other things, pressures of homeschooling, etc. So it's been an enormously challenging time for both people and businesses. And as I say, I think now is round about the right time to really begin thinking about that journey to recovery. And so really this webinar has been set up with that in mind. And I'm delighted to be joined on this webinar by Amanda Coleman. Amanda Coleman was the head of corporate communications at Greater Manchester Police for 18 years, and as such, clearly she was in the front line of responding to very high-profile crises for almost 2 decades, and has dealt with and communicated about more crises than many of us have had hot dinners. Amanda is now an independent crisis communication expert and is the author of a newly published book called Crisis Communication Strategies. And Amanda brings to this session her experience of crisis communication in general, but one particular experience in being in the very forefront of the response to the Manchester Arena terror attack on the 22nd of May 2017, which you will recall took the lives of 22 innocent people, and learned lots of lessons about recovering from crisis as a result of that. So, Amanda, welcome to you too.
Yes, thanks, Jonathan. That sounds like a lot. I can't believe I've quite done that, but yes. And you're right. This is a challenging phase that we go into, definitely. and it's worth pointing out, I say the book, the reason I wrote the book came as a direct kind of aftermath of the learning from dealing with the arena as well, because there was so much that we learned from that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for being kind enough to share those learnings. So what Amanda and I are going to do is walk through a few slides. Me being me, I will no doubt interrupt Amanda as she goes through those slides. I will then have probably 3 or 4 additional questions. And as per usual, if you would like to post any of your questions via the question or chat box, I'll make sure that we pick up on those at the end. So Amanda, I'm going to move the slide on. And if you then let me know when you want to move on to the next slide. I will endeavour to press the right button at the right time.
I don't want to do like the government do. Next slide.
That's it, anyway. You've got it.
But we'll work through it. The first thing really is very much as you said, Jonathan, it's around using this as a time to focus on where we are and what we've learned. And it's important not to rush and think this is a recovery phase that we're in, because I don't think it necessarily is. I don't think it definitely is. It's a more kind of sort of mid-crisis, if we can call it that.
Yeah.
It's a middle phase of the crisis. It's not actually a recovery. And it's difficult because there are a number of kind of pointers to what I'm going to ramble on, and I'm probably going to go completely out of my slide format here. But no, I think there's some questions that will point you towards whether you're at recovery or not. But for me, the recovery phase is probably the most complicated. It's the most complex, and it's more challenging. If people think that the crisis bit is challenging, actually the response phase I think can be more so. And as you all know, Jonathan, as you all have worked at, lots of people focus heavily on the crisis element of the initial response and being ready for that, and having everything in place and being able to manage the initial time when a crisis emerges. But actually we spend remarkably little time thinking about this recovery phase, and yet it is probably one of the more challenging phases, and quite continued high stakes, as was with the first.
I mean, certainly in that first phase, you get through on adrenaline, you get through, through a sense of purpose, don't you, and direction. And it's, if you've planned well, it's kind of clear what needs to be done. And I know a lot of people, in many ways, enjoy that first phase of the crisis because, as I say, purpose is so clear. You're full of energy. I guess, like you say, we're going through almost the pre-recovery phase, which I think is quite a difficult phase too, because that initial burst of energy has gone and you've been working through this relentlessly for such a long period of time. And I mean, I'm just interested, before you continue, Amanda, I mean, how do you know when the time is right to go into this recovery phase if we're kind of still mid-crisis now?
Yeah, there are a number of things for me. There's a bit around what stage is the response at.
Yeah.
So, six key questions, and I go into the book in some detail. There's sort of 7 questions, but are people still coming forward to say that they've been directly adversely affected by what's happened? Is the crisis under control? Is it potentially still growing, or is it expanding? Is the business able to, I'm not going to say return to normal, because normal now is banished from, new normal's definitely banished from my vocabulary, but are you returning to this sort of usual operational activity? Are you thinking about the future, or are you constantly still thinking about the present and the next few days, the next week? And what's the level of staffing involved in the response? So if that's still really high in terms of the numbers that of staff that are focused on the response phase, then you're not at recovery. And then probably one of the most critical bits for me, and that is what's the public mood towards the issue or incident. And the reason I've kind of used this photograph was very early on it's probably at the end of the first week of the Manchester Arena attack. So it happened on the Monday, and it was either the Friday or the sort of weekend. We were having conversations, both ourselves and Manchester City Council, with looking at recovery and looking at recovery phase. And people wanted to start proactively talking about recovery. but the mood of the city, the mood of the people, the kind of atmosphere was still dealing with what had happened. So it was
Yeah.
nowhere near recovery. And we needed to both myself and the then head of comms at City Council gave that message. We can't talk about it publicly. It is not, its time isn't right. The mood isn't right. So I think one of the most important things for people to understand is where are your the people you deal with, the service users, the customers. What are their thoughts on it? Are they still in crisis kind of response and of some form mode, or are they thinking about recovery? And that'll be, I think, a really good indicator, a really good pointer as to whether you're there or not. So those are sort of some key things really around it.
And I think in this current situation, the COVID-19 situation, that is one of the biggest challenges. We were talking with a client yesterday because everybody is experiencing this situation very differently, and everyone has different levels of stress and anxiety and pressures. And there are at least two crises. One is clearly a health crisis, and one is also an economic crisis. And I think a lot of business leaders are grappling at the moment with wanting to continue to be really empathetic and caring and put their people first, whilst also recognizing that their businesses face serious challenges at the moment, and what might be best in purely business terms might be different to what is best for their people. But there is going to be a moment when you have to get back to business, and I think that's a very sensitive judgment at the moment.
Definitely. And I think the other thing that's worth playing out in this, and coming from a policing background, is if we'd had an incident. The arena was a case in point. We had some members of staff that were actually at the concert.
Yeah.
So they were given time off to go home to kind of just come to terms, deal with what they'd been through.
Yes.
And normally in a crisis situation, that's what you'd do. If somebody was personally affected, you would give them the breathing space to deal with it away from everybody else who would deal with the response. We're all dealing with COVID-19, so you haven't got the luxury of being able to give people that breathing space.
Yeah.
So there's an additional big pressure that is I know people are talking about psychological, kind of emotional, mental well-being, but it's going to be something that's going to be needed for everybody at some point, because we're living through personal issues as well.
Yes, absolutely. Do you want me to?
Okay, I'm not sure what the next slide is.
Move on. Here we go. Let's find out. Hang on a second. There we go.
Yeah. So kind of three elements for me which are important in terms of looking at the focus of recovery are the reputation and trust and confidence. It's important to know the detail of what's happened. It's important to understand what's been happening, what people have been saying about the business and the organisation and the response. So there's a number of sort of elements. It's what was people's views of the organisation before the crisis, and how have they changed, and what do they look like now? And the key focusing going forward, and you're right, Jonathan, knowing how challenging it's going to be, but it's around building that trust and confidence within the workforce in terms of trying to do the best thing for where you are and where and trying to help in terms of the business front, but also for them as individuals. And you can have, I was reading some interesting things about how you can have a good redundancy, which sounds a bit weird, but I think, having been through being made redundant many years ago, actually you can. It's the way you do it. It's how you communicate it. It's how you support people through it. So it's not, nobody's going to like some of the things that we're going to face in the weeks, months, years ahead. But there are ways of kind of minimising the negative, detrimental impacts, and sort of hand-holding to support people through some of the difficult times ahead. So absolutely would say this, I suppose, but communication for me is going to be critical in managing those processes and changes and difficulties as we go forward.
Well, I think that's true what you were saying about good redundancies, for example. I mean, I think the crisis itself that we've been going through over the last few months, and what is going to happen in terms of people losing their jobs, these are tests of leadership, and these are moments when we find out whether the values of an organization and the values of its leaders are more than skin deep. And, if you've got to make tough decisions, either around the crisis or around people's jobs, are those being done in a manner which is compassionate, honest, humane, supportive? And, we've been talking throughout this situation about people will remember how you behaved at this time because it's such a visceral moment in time. And I think people will continue to remember how you behave. So I guess my advice, if you want to build that trust and confidence, is act in line with your values and clearly just show great empathy for those with whom you are communicating.
Yeah, I know, and we're at risk of totally agreeing with each other, but that's probably a good thing. But yeah, there's the two things I think are critical in terms of humanity and empathy. As you're saying, the communication needs to have that. It's been a challenge really because of the scale, I think, of some of this. When we were dealing with the arenas, particularly, we had 22 victims and their associated families, so it was something that we heavily focused on in terms of supporting them and giving them as much support as we possibly could going forward and going through things. It's really challenging because of the scale of this. That's why I suppose it's very much looking at what's relevant to you and trying not to get, because you can so easily get sucked into the massive scale of the way the world may need to change and what we all may need to do. Whereas actually, let's just focus on the elements is us and that we need to perhaps focus on. So, yeah, the key bit for us for this is.
It's just breaking up a little bit, Amanda. I'm just going to say a couple of things in the hope that no, it's fine. Just in the hope it strengthens again. I think
it seems to have sorted itself.
It has. No, that's good. So I think what you were saying, Amanda, was focus on the things you can control rather than things you can't control.
Yeah, because there's a huge amount of uncertainty, and that's the thing. I think because of the scale and the vastness of some of this, it's very easy to get lost in that the vastness instead of focusing on what matters. Where are we now? It's where were we? Where are we currently? And what does that future then potentially look like? And focus very much on those things because the trust and confidence come from what as you were saying before, it comes from what you say and what you do. It doesn't come from just what you say. It's very much living what you say, isn't it, from a leadership position?
Absolutely. And again, just seeing these three words on this slide, just to pick up on the reputation side for the people on this call, I think in many ways businesses, and it's primarily businesses who are represented on this webinar, have had an incredibly challenging time over the last few months. However, only if you have behaved absolutely appallingly have you been, called out, certainly by the media and a number of other stakeholders over the last 2 or 3 months. There are a small number of organisations that behaved or perceived to have behaved so badly that they were called out. I guess as we move into this next phase, I suspect, the magnifying glass is going to hover over individual businesses more closely in terms of what happens next than it did in the previous phase. So, if we continue the kind of thought process with regard to redundancies, I think, the way that is executed, I don't think organisations will be quite so hidden from attention or scrutiny or criticism as they were in the initial phase when everybody was just struggling to get to grips with it, and people were being given almost a bit of a pass out if they didn't get it 100% right. I think that will change over the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, definitely. I think there was people understood how difficult it was for everybody, and to have this and how it suddenly kind of changed everything overnight virtually. I think as you go forward, you're right. There will be less. There are a bit forgiving, perhaps to start with, and perhaps be a bit less of that. And particularly when it starts to get very personal, if people are going to face redundancy potentially, or other problems going forward.
Yeah. Do you want me to
click
on, Amanda?
Should we do the next slide?
Let's do that.
So for me,
I've missed one there. I think there we go.
There are four.
I told you I couldn't click.
Four bits. Oh, don't worry. There are four elements I think are really critical in terms of managing and thinking about the recovery phase. And the first, as we kind of just said a little bit, it was around reviewing, having the data and insight, the monitoring of what's happened. Debriefing. Now, debriefing is one of my I've got lots of issues, I think, of things that I think are so critical that I get frustrated that perhaps other people don't think are quite as important. And debriefing what you do is so critical right the way through the crisis. Because I can't remember exactly what I did on the 23rd of March. The decisions that people make in the early stages of a crisis, you absolutely need to have found a way of looking at what worked, what didn't work, what could you do differently, and building that knowledge as you go forward. The frustration is I know some people won't have done that because they were so busy and they won't have had it as a priority, and they'll get to this point of kind of pre-recovery, if we call it that, where they will have trying to think back to what happened, and really useful bits of information may have been lost along the way. So it's a big push for me to try and encourage people to think about debriefing their activities on a regular basis as they go through this. Looking at things like reputation trackers, looking at things about the sentiment towards the organisation, and really understanding where that's got to, so that you can then use that as you look at the focus for the future and the focus of the recovery communication. Rebuilding, looking at the operational pre-crisis, what was the organisation doing, because it's quite easy to kind of forget some of the challenges you may have had before a massive crisis hits. But they'll still be there, and you'll still have to pick them up at some point. So it's important to kind of go back to pre-crisis, and how the world looked for you then. Looking at then the reputation and the impact that's had, and looking in terms of what may need to change. Now, in a lot of crisis situations, you might find that as an organisation, it doesn't have such a fundamental impact that you need to change your ways of working, your priorities, your values, your principles. What we're seeing with COVID, obviously, is it absolutely is going to affect all of those things. So it's important to start to look at what you may need to rebuild, because what you may need to change around the priorities. The priorities might have been, to go international. Well, that will need to change. So it's about that refocusing phase and pulling that all together.
And I think that's one of the things that, again, in the first phase of this crisis, I think some leaders found quite challenging, because, leaders by their nature, set and focus on targets and drive towards a particular place, and they have control and influence over how that happens, and they can shape things to their advantage. And this whole new uncertain, unpredictable, dynamic world I think has proven challenging for a number of leaders, but those that have succeeded have been able to be more nimble and more flexible, and to quickly get beyond the kind of denial that the world has changed, to exactly as you say, Amanda, to recognize that what you were aiming for yesterday, last week, last month, beginning of the year, if you delude yourself and are still aiming for that, then you are definitively going to fail. So I think really good advice there about flexing the purpose of the organization, and that's quite a big deal, isn't it? But I think you're right that at a time of such significant change, you have to do that, otherwise you are, as I say, doomed to failure, because the old goals are no longer achievable.
And in some places, have similar conversations around this sort, you can imagine, over the weeks. And it's almost, if it needs be, have a blank piece of paper, and start almost not start again, but it will be a bit of a right. What do we do? What are we going to do? And then work backwards, because the old things that you have done, lots of times before, probably won't be the same. You won't perhaps do it the same.
Mm-hmm.
If you run a pub, it's almost like, right, what we aimed to do in terms of providing people with X, Y, and Z, right? How can we look at doing that as we go forward?
Yes.
And if we still hang on to too much of how things were done in the past, then I think we're going to struggle to really move as we need to, which it's a massive challenge. I mean, I'm not underestimating the impact and the challenge that this is, and this is going to be, but that for me is one of the ways forward with this is, almost have that blank piece of paper and try and look at what is still relevant from what we've had in the past.
Yeah.
Resources, well, I mean, you would put this, because I have a massive issue in that we commit a lot of resource in lots of areas when we're dealing with the initial crisis as it happens, and then often we try and push people back into what they're used to do.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a massive balancing act with old work, new work, redesign, crisis recovery. So you can't just expect to be able to do all this additional work along with everything else. So the kind of prioritization, looking at that, understanding the staffing levels that are needed, and being really realistic in some cases. And for communications teams that I talk to, I do often, say that they've got to be quite definitive around this to leaders and say, I can do X and Y, but if Z then comes in, which is all perhaps the recovery phase, I can't do what we were committed to do before, because, unless you're going to give me additional resources, which is unlikely in lots of cases, it's about cutting your cloth according to what we've actually got. And in this recovery phase, don't underestimate, the impact in terms of the amount of people and resources that might be needed to deliver it effectively. And really, we want an effective recovery phase, because if we're not, then when we get to the last bit of this, which is re-establishing the brand, re-establishing the company, we're not going to be in the position to do it effectively. And that's going to be the most critical, because that's going to be about organisational survival in whatever shape that it is going to be, or failure potentially, which is going to then leave us in a very difficult position in terms of the future of the business ultimately. For me, in the re-establish phase as well, you want to be trying to involve others, service users, customers, victims, stakeholders, and help them to be part of the re-establishing, which is potentially the strongest, most strengthened position going forward will be if you can have involved others, rather than just trying to go alone and get to that point of, right, here we are, this is what we are now, this is how we do things now. When you're in a position to be able to articulate what that future could look like, is to try and find a way of involving people to do that, involving people to help you do that.
And
I suppose the other thing for me, just on a final bit, and then I'll shut up on this, is that, like we said, we were saying about reputation before, but that none of this can be just built on reputation management. Because if this is just about trying to manage the reputation of the business, then it's fundamentally going to be built on, I suppose, on quicksand. Because it's got to really be about the future of the business, and not just trying to look as though things are going to be done in the right way for the right reasons.
Absolutely. I just wanted to violently agree with you on resources as well. And it's something on these webinars that we've been running over the last few months that we've touched on a number of occasions. And I just thought it was worth emphasizing again that, we've talked about setting strategic intent on previous webinars. In other words, where you want to get to. And, you were talking, Amanda, about, purpose of the organization potentially having to change. And then the next step after setting that strategic intent is determining what your top priorities are at that time and where you want to invest your resources, because again, exactly as Amanda said, there is going to be more that could be done than you have the resource available to do. And it's important to be very focused around saying, in the recovery phase, what are the most critical areas that we need to focus on? and that is where we are going to place our resource. It's a prioritization job, and it's painful sometimes to know that you are not putting as much resource into some other areas as you would like, but it's about placing that resource where it's going to make most difference. So go back to that concept of strategic intent and top priority, and focus your resources accordingly.
Yeah, that's it. And it's very much like you would do if you were doing the risk management pre any crisis, isn't it? You know, you don't do the scenarios for every conceivable, everything that could happen. You focus on what are the most critical ones.
Yes.
And with this, and speaking to communications people, a lot of the time we have a whole long list of things that could be really good, would be really good. But it's about where's the biggest impact as well, isn't it? Where's the biggest impact, and focus on what will bring those best delivery, really best response as you go forward.
Quite. Okay.
Okay. Do you want to do the next?
Yep.
At least saying next slide, because
there we go.
Fabulous. This is my blank piece of paper bit, as we were just saying before, because it's important really to it's a very hard kind of psychological thing, isn't it, to let go of things. And partway through dealing with the arena, I kept saying, oh God, I just want things to return to normal. I just want it to be kind of normal. But it became very obvious that there was going to be no going back to the way things were, because we'd lived through what we'd lived through. So, you know, for Manchester, it'll always be there. For everybody that was affected, it'll always be there. So for me, it's you know, I'm not going to say new normal, because that's a phrase I've banned along with unprecedented, but it's very much looking at what the future could be, and to try and find those positives going forward. And it might feel hard, I think, at the moment for people to see anything positive from what is and has been a really horrendous experience, and for some people it's been, you know, personally tragic. But there will be ways forward that are more positive, and where we can take and build sort of more positive future. Key bits around a roadmap. In recovery, really, for me, it needs to be planned effectively, and we need to be doing the planning whilst we're dealing with the crisis, and that in itself is a challenge, isn't it? You know, to be able to think future, as well as the day-to-day that's causing demands and causing pressure. But we really do need to be able to do that, and to start to roadmap that way to the future, like you said before, Jonathan, about where the priorities are, and map that out, using the data and insight, using the knowledge and experience, using what you know of the affected people. And again, for me, that's very much mapping that through, much as you would with stakeholders, really. You know, you get the moment of impact, you get the pebble in the pond, so you get that moment, and the people right at the centre are the most affected, and then you can work that out. Now, you can do the same for staff, you know, in terms of you'll have employees who potentially are more affected by what's happened, or what's going to happen even potentially, you know. So start to be able to map that out, because how you communicate is going to be more challenging. We've seen it with the government, really. To the start of the crisis, it was very easy for them to say, stay at home, you know, this is what you need to do, in a very directive way. Then as we get to this phase where things start to change, it's much more difficult. You know, it's strands of different kind of community, different messages, which need to weave together as a tapestry, really, to make a picture for people. So that's why I think, you know, you do need to be able to identify the different strands in terms of those affected, and what you need to say, and how we can communicate with them. And then for me, going forward, are trigger points. So there'll be elements that are going to impact on the business, or impact on individuals, that we need to be able to plan for. We need to be able to identify in terms of how we move forward. So, you know, I call them the trigger points. So if you were dealing with, we knew this in dealing, we'll go back to the arena because it's one of the probably easier ones to kind of map through. But we knew that there were going to be victims' families that were going to have funerals. We knew there were going to be, there's going to be an inquiry. We knew there was going to be an inquest. So you could start to chart some of those. We also had the other things. So we knew that if there was going to be an incident, if there was another terrorist incident anywhere in the world, it was likely to have an impact on, the people directly at the centre and other people. So you could start to then map some of the other aspects that might trigger. So you might find it's something that happens within your business. If you work in the car industry, then obviously what's happened with Rolls-Royce, the announcement, is going to have an impact on your staff. So like I say, it's just thinking those through and being able to identify those as trigger points that you can use so you can map out how you go forward. Trying also to build resilience for the business, as well as resilience for individuals. And I think we talked about this at the start, didn't we? But that's going to be a challenge because people need to be fit enough to be able to take the business forward, need to be able to take things forward. And that means them having support, whatever they might need in terms of trying to deal with where they are and how they can then, deal with issues that they have had to kind of come to terms with and be ready to move forwards. The same for the organisation, the same for the business. Where is it? How is it going to be able to be strong enough to go forwards? And that's really critical in the recovery phase.
And are there any kind of learnings and or practical tips or advice you could give from your experience, particularly with the arena attack, as to how businesses and or people can build that resilience going forward, Amanda?
Yeah, I think for the individuals, it's very much around having access to support that they may need, and to recognise that some people will need support today and tomorrow. Some might need it in a month, 2 months' time. It depends on them as individuals, and that's quite challenging for an organisation with its employees will be coming back and they'll be in sort of different phases. There are lots of support mechanisms, charities and various other organisations that offer online access to support, and as well as, potentially encouraging people to seek more help, perhaps via NHS if needed. And again, it's probably almost like doing that sort of 4 boxes again. Who are the most affected? Who perhaps might need the most help? Where are they likely to be? What jobs have they potentially been doing? So you can tailor it a little bit. And encouraging, if you've got a workforce where you've got some managers, well, you can skill up the managers to be able to prime and signpost people. We don't want to be experts in dealing with psychological, emotional, whatever issues. But it's more about recognising the kind of issues where the signs that you can then point people in the right direction. Because I think there was a lot of conversation about people in the NHS who may be struggling with post-traumatic stress. And again, we will potentially see elements of that across workforces. So it's about spotting the signs so that you can try and signpost people to get the right help. Through doing that, then they can start to rebuild, and that's where obviously you can build some resilience in. I think organisationally, it's about being as fit as you can be. So, look at what the impact has been, look at where the issues may have been in terms of the crisis and the impact, and what might be needed to support that team, those teams that are particularly involved, and how you can take that forward. Having clear plans, having clear procedures and things, that you can call upon in the uncertainty, because a lot about the resilience comes to managing uncertainty as best we can. And that's why I think my last point was around change management, because a lot of the pre-recovery phase is going to be around really effective change management and change communication that will go alongside that. And that's quite a skill that sometimes we don't utilise, we don't see that we need this recovery phase.
And again, having observed the kind of building of resilience phase within Greater Manchester Police, any kind of tips for leaders and managers, who may be feeling apprehensive about, how they are going to welcome people back into the organisation, and how, they may be feeling themselves ill-equipped to deal with the anxieties or stresses that people are feeling, without, again, suggesting that they should turn into, psychological counselling experts. Would there be any guidelines you would give in terms of how they can support their people best?
Yeah, I think it's about looking at sort of Charity Mind produced quite a lot of documents
Yeah,
that are available online, and they give some really good hints and tips of what to look for in the workplace. So I think that's a good starting
yeah,
point. I know there's something similar that's been produced that's on NHS, but I
yeah,
actually found it less useful than some of the Mind things,
yes,
because that does give some really practical advice about what to look for and what to do. But I think the key starting point in all this is to recognise it.
yes,
Like you said, it's about recognising there will be a difficult time for
yes,
employees and for businesses, and let's not try and pretend that it's anything less.
yeah,
That's not to say I want everybody to go around being really
no,
down
no,
and downbeat, but I think it's just about being really honest.
yes,
A lot of what we've said through the whole, this whole kind of session is around, it's that honesty and that
yes,
authenticity that I think are critical,
yes,
because that will be what helps people deal with what
yeah,
has happened
yeah.
and be in a right place to be able to move forward.
And again, I'd reflect on a review session that we ran yesterday with a client, and actually the people on that call, some of whom were not senior leaders, said actually how much they valued the guidance and support of their managers and leaders in terms of directing them to credible, objective sources of information about the health implications of COVID-19 when they felt overwhelmed by the information coming in their direction, and actually kind of turning to people who they trusted helped them to get the best information and make sense of it. And I think there might be a role there in this next phase, as you were saying, Amanda, about leaders and managers doing their own research at kind of an organizational level to say, in terms of mental health, here are some of the best, most credible resources out there. Mind was a great example that you gave. As an organization, that will be our kind of default place to get our people to go and take a look at, rather than them having to search it out themselves or perhaps turn to resources which are not quite so useful. So again, in times of uncertainty, people do turn to their leaders and managers, their people that they trust, and if we can be helping people to navigate their way through, I think that's a really important service that we can provide.
Yeah, it's definitely trusted voice.
Yeah,
As I was kind of referred to it. Go back in the early, what was it 2012? We had the riots in London, and then we had some in Manchester, and the way that we managed to effectively kind of navigate through that and be in a positive position for the policing after the problems we'd had was
yes,
to become the trusted voice. So
yeah,
we had to, really connect with people and tell them exactly what was going on and be really open about it, which was really challenging for some of the senior people. But that was the way, we became a trusted voice for what was happening in Manchester and in the areas. What were we doing
yes,
about it? And people would turn to us rather than the rumours, and that's very much, like you say, where you would want to be,
yeah,
to find managers or be the leaders in the business that can be the trusted voice. This is what we're doing. This is what's happening.
yeah.
This is where you can get help. Yeah, that's going to really help people through.
Fantastic. We're moving on to our final slide of Amanda's section of the presentation, and we have about 15 or 16 minutes left. So we already have a couple of questions. If there are questions that you would like to put in the final session of this webinar, please do post them via the question or chat pane, and we will put those to Amanda in the final 10 minutes or so of the webinar. So let me see if I can still success. There we go. On to the next, Amanda.
Yeah. and this is my crystal ball, you see, for the future, um, which it does feel like we're trying to crystal ball what the future might look like at the moment with everything that's going on. But the important things to remember, and not to rush. Recovery will come when it is right, as we were saying right back at the start. Don't rush to it. The mood and tone, what's happening around, not just the business. It's taking that environmental scanning really to the centre of what you're doing, so that you are in the right place to move forward when it's the right time to do it, and ensuring that there's support available. As we were talking, the trusted voice that you say, where's the best support that you can give people to help to build that resilience, to help to build the resilience for the business. We know as well that crises don't happen neatly one after the other, do they? And we've already seen EasyJet have their own issues. There was the plane crash in Pakistan.
Yes.
There's been floods over in Canada.
Yes.
Things will happen that will impact on us whilst we're still trying to deal with this. So, I don't want to scare anybody, and I'm not trying to do that. But it's just about being aware that could still happen. So you still need to be mindful of that, which is why I say, going back to one of my bugbears about debriefs, which is why debriefs are so important, because, if something happened yesterday that you really need to change in the way you use for planning tomorrow, then make that change now. Don't wait, because, this incident, next issue might emerge right around the corner. And look about the managing change. The important sort of principles around managing change will be really essential in the recovery phase, particularly because of the scale of the recovery of how it will look post COVID, or even living with COVID, however you want to talk about it. Look at that, the change management principles and the communication around change that is really critical. And it is about just being a bit brave. I think it's going to definitely be about being brave to say, right, the scenarios for the future could be like this, and seeing some of the positives that come from that, as well as, we don't obviously want to lose a lot of things that we might have got used to, but some of them I think we're going to need to accept that will change, and to look at the positive aspects that we can build into the future.
Interesting.
So that was my last thing, is to try and encourage people to just be a bit brave about those scenarios going forward.
Talk to me a bit more about being brave, Amanda, in the context that we're facing now. What might bravery look like?
I think bravery comes to accepting that blank piece of paper might be in front of you.
Yeah.
And if you've spent 10, 20 years building up a business to look a particular way, because it worked, and it probably worked really well, in the pre-COVID times.
Yes.
Being able to say, I accept that needs to change now.
Yes.
And we need to fundamentally do things differently. It's going to have to be, that's bravery, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because a lot of people have put a lot of personal energy, effort, and themselves into what they've created for the businesses. No matter whether they're large, small, medium-sized, it doesn't matter. You will, you can't run a business or be at a senior position in a business and not really care and put a lot of yourself into that. Because you wouldn't be doing a particularly good job, and it would be called out quite quickly, I think. So bravery for me going forward is going to be, well, my mum likes it. I shouldn't bring my mum into webinars. My mum likes it to pioneers. There'll be people who, from this moment, will be the pioneers that take things forward, and that's where I think the bravery comes. Is the people who are able to be pioneering to find the way through, positively into the next few years.
Yeah, it's that cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true that out of crisis comes opportunity, and in some ways, you can view this as an exciting opportunity, and as you say, it's about potentially creating something new, different, better. It's almost liberating that that old world cannot be completely recovered, so what are we going to do to make it even better than it was before? So I've seen research that says in times of crisis, there are more inventions than at any other time, and certainly we are dramatically reinventing our ways of working. And, we've all found lots of benefits out of virtual and home working that I suspect would have taken decades to achieve, what we've achieved over the last 2 or 3 months. I'm not saying it's perfect yet, but I feel like we have learned some lessons and made some discoveries that we wouldn't otherwise have made.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and it does sound like a cliche, but I think it's just because it's how things happen, it's how things work, and the people who are brave, pioneering, see the future, can move quickly, can be flexible, will be the ones that come through this probably I suppose the least scars, the fewest scars, than perhaps other people may come through it.
Yes.
But they'll perhaps have a few more scars along the way than they'd want to have.
Quite. Okay, so a couple of questions, Amanda. So what do you do if the organisation wants to move to recovery too early?
Yeah, I think this is really important. It's about being able to influence as much as possible. So have the case studies, have the examples, have the information, have the data, have the particularly the information around the external environment and what the people are seeing from the very much need to see it from the outside in rather than the inside out. So what are people saying? Because that mood and tone is going to be critical, and I think it's important to really have the information that you can play into that discussion around recovery. That's what worked. That's what we were able to do around the arena. This is what feedback looks like, and even if it's just this is what the sentiment is around social media, whatever you can absolutely get, what you can get your hands on that will help you to give that argument convincingly and explain that position. Because if nothing else, if whoever's doing this question, if nothing else, come speak to me. I'll give you some of the information we had that helped us around the arena, because it was down to what people were saying on social media. It was down to what people were saying to the media when they were out and about, and using all that to be able to explain, and hopefully that will help. Use those case studies of where people have talked about recovery too soon. When people are still fighting through what they're dealing with, it doesn't end particularly well for the organisations that do that.
Absolutely. Question here from Alan: how can you monitor how well the recovery is going?
Yeah, it goes down to really if you have a roadmap of sort of where you would like to be at particular points, then you've obviously got something to gauge your success against.
Right.
I think the difficulty is if you just say, right, at the end of recovery, we want it to look like this.
Yeah.
That's going to be really challenging because you won't know until you get to the end of recovery of whatever you've designated the end of recovery might look like. So it's very much having those markers along the way that you can gauge. Have you achieved that? Does it look like that? Is the feedback at this point? What does it look like? And then you can obviously amend, because a crisis plan, a crisis comms plan, a recovery plan, they all need to be living documents. They all need to be subject to change. They all need to take into account that the world may move on around you as you're moving through both the crisis and the recovery phase as well.
Fantastic. Well, look, you've led me very neatly into my next couple of slides, Amanda. So I'm going to go to those in a minute before formally thanking you. But actually, just as I was about to do that, we've got one more question, so I will put that first. So Valerie asks, in terms of bravery, a colleague and I wrote the book Braver Than You Think. We found that bravery happened when people felt that they had no choice but to do the thing that they were afraid of. Do you think it's true that bravery isn't the absence of fear, but having a more powerful motivation which helps you rise above fear?
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of books that feel the fear and do it anyway. There's lots of things. I don't think being brave means you are fearless. you see bravery. If you look at bravery in terms of the physical emergency services type bravery, or those sort of elements, people rushing into burning buildings, it's not because they've fearless. It's because they've seen what the fear is, but their motivation to save somebody, their motivation to take them into that place. So absolutely, yeah, I would totally agree with you. I think fear isn't absent from people when they are being brave. It's just that they have seen something that motivates them beyond it.
Absolutely. I think there's a great sense of purpose at the moment. And I think whilst, again, what we've been facing has made people, many of us, feel anxious and concerned, it's actually also given us a sense of purpose. So again, there are some positives coming out of these challenging times. So I do just want to share a couple of other slides from my side before, as I say, thanking Amanda formally. From an Insignia perspective, we do have resources on our website, which are free resources, checklists, downloads, videos to help you begin your own recovery from this situation. And I did want to, because clients are really seeing the value of them, talk to you about some of our services which are not free, which I think can help with the journey to recovery. Two in particular, two workshops. One is a crisis review workshop focused on people. I do think now is an important time to pause, to reflect, review, revive and reset. And so we are running half-day virtual workshops for teams of people, whether they're leadership teams, communication teams, business continuity teams, to actually look back on what we've been through so far, share some of our learning, share some of our hopes and fears for the future, because you do have to be brave and you do have to be strong looking forward. And there's a lot of, I think, crisis fatigue at the moment. And by going through a workshop of this kind, you can emerge as a team which can commit to the future with confidence, purpose and direction. So that is a workshop to recalibrate and refocus your team or teams. The second one is much more about the plans themselves, the crisis management and crisis communication plans. And Amanda referred to it on a couple of occasions whereby, you know, there will undoubtedly have been multiple learnings coming out of how you responded to the first phase of this crisis. I got into this line of work through being passionate about not wanting to see businesses or people suffer needlessly because of a mishandled crisis. And it would be criminal not to integrate those learnings and actions into your crisis management processes going forward. So this workshop is about evaluating the successes, what went really well that we need to embed within our plans going forward, what didn't go so well, what was missing, what did we think was a great process but actually in practice didn't work, and therefore what are the actions that we're going to take to make ourselves better prepared for the future. The outcome of that half-day online workshop is enhanced plans, resources and ways of working to make sure that we are ready for the next crisis. And again, I am passionate about this. There will be more crises, sadly, both, you know, those to do with the remainder of however long we have to deal with COVID-19, but also the completely unrelated crises, which are so much more damaging or potentially damaging at the moment when businesses are already weakened. So please do let me know if you would be interested in talking to us about either of those two workshops. As I say, before finishing though, Amanda, thank you so much for sharing both your, you know, immense professional experience, but also your personal experience of being in the forefront of crisis situations, and for providing